Why, hello. Please come in. Let me tell you a tale of two Guan Daos. What's a Guan Dao? This is a Guan Dao. Long, long ago, deep in the mists of time, when I first immigrated to Australia, excuse me, I did not have a Guan Dao to train with. Those were sad days. I was Guan Dao less. And so I searched high and low for a weapon that would satisfy my needs. And after I had seen my fair share of dodgy martial arts supply stores online, selling creams and unguents, sketchy training videos, bootleg Bruce Lee knockoffs, and mole ninja shuriken, I realized that I could not find a commercially available Guan Dao that was heavy and sturdy enough for my liking. So I designed my own. In fact, I commissioned several companies to fabricate the various parts for me because, as well as not having in addition to not having a Guan Dao at the time, I also did not have a workshop. Yes, I know, the horror of it was exceedingly great. And this is what my first Guan Dao looked like. It weighs 12 kilograms. This may not sound heavy to the uninitiated, but let me assure you that it is heavy for a pole arm. It's one thing to lift 12 kilograms in the gym, bro. It's another matter entirely to swing it around as a weapon. It's nearly twice as heavy, in fact, as the heaviest commercially available Guan Dao that I could find. I had the blade and counterbalance commissioned to be cut out of 8mm thick steel, and the blade profile ground in. I then had these pieces heat treated and chromed by separate companies before I assembled it using a thick-walled agricultural plumbing tube as the shaft. However, when I first tried to use it, this Guan Dao felt incredibly heavy, terribly slow, and extremely clumsy. I just wasn't strong enough, in fact, to train with it properly. So because this Guan Dao was as heavy as it was, I had to build another Guan Dao, a heavier one, to make the 12-kilogram one feel lighter to me. So deep in the fires of Mount Stupid, another Guan Dao was forged, and into it I poured all of my hopes and dreams of being able to swing that lighter Guan Dao around with speed, and thus was the heavy Guan Dao born. As you can see, it is simply a weights bar with dissimilar weights on either end, and balanced roughly as a Guan Dao should be. And I use the word roughly in the loosest possible sense of the word. It weighs 25 kilograms. It's just ridiculous to use. If you make even the slightest mistake in your motion, its momentum can seriously injure you. In fact, I nearly broke my ankle during one of the jumps while using this beast. Fortunately, my ankle held up and was just badly sprained with no bone or tendon, permanent bone or tendon injuries. I was lucky. However, despite all these difficulties, training with the stupid heavy Guan Dao, which I might add I still do today, worked, and I became more able to shift the lighter Guan Dao around with a reasonable ease and speed and competence. I say reasonable because one should always remember that it is still a 12 kilogram Guan Dao, and not the light, fluffy little things that are often whipped around with great speed at demonstrations. and so things and so things continued for many years. But I grew older, and dare I say it, a little wiser. I felt the need to have a lighter, nimbler, and far deadlier Guan Dao in my weapons collection, on my weapons rack, ready to go, so to speak. I also needed a lighter one to teach my students with, because my light Guan Dao was just too much Guan Dao for a beginner to handle. And so I studied the ancient texts, following the exploits of our favorite general Guan Yi, who, as we all know, stood at a height of 2 meters, had a 23 centimeter long beard, his face was of the color of a dark Zhao, with lips that were red and plump, his eyes were like those of a crimson phoenix, and his eyebrows resembled reclining silkworms. A truly dignified and majestic man. And after much study and reference to surviving antique examples and historic depictions of Guan Dao's, the dark flame dragon blade took shape and was born.
Have you forgotten about that which dwells within me?
The Dark Dragon?
No, the dragon within me is beyond that level. It has evolved into the Dark Flame Dragon!
It is the light Guan Dao to end all my future quests for a perfect combat Guan Dao. It's light, nimble, deadly. The dark flame dragon had in fact chosen a new vessel.
In its 4,000-year history, the Dark Flame Dragon only allowed 6 who possessed dark powers to be its trusted vessel.
Okay. I'll stop the silliness now. Here's what really happened behind the scenes. Hi, Lester, Wisher Engineer. Thanks to Angor Rain and Nagel for their comment on my latest video regarding video format and presentation. So, because of their comment, we will actually keep this format for now. I don't see any reason not to. Typically, I'm standing around. This is perhaps a little bit more informal, more sort of conversational. So, hopefully, you enjoy it. Anyway, it's been a little while since I've built a weapon on my channel. And I felt a bit inspired after talking to my old mate Jono. So I decided to build a Guan Dao blade attachment. The blade attachment that I'd actually always intended to build for my for an older project that I'd built, which is the folding weapons platform. Now I featured that on my channel in a number of videos. And actually, I even have plans for that up on our Wushu Workshop website for free download. So for those who are interested in trying to build it, it is a pretty complex project, but it's there. So if you're interested, you can build that. A Guan Dao
is a polearm weapon, very similar actually in structure and dimensions to a European farshad. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can fight about it in the comments. It typically has a stout, heavy curved blade with an assortment of hooks and serrations on the back end. The counterbalance on the end of the pole, which of course is there to counterbalance the weight of the blade and the pole, make it a little bit more balanced, can be used to stab or strike with. It typically has a bit of a pointed end, but is often more like a mace head, really, a small pointed mace head. It's typically used by infantry, it would seem, but was also used from cavalry from time to time. It has a certain mythical origin, which is heavily associated with the historical figure of General Guan Yi, who is very, very well regarded, very highly regarded, who has said to have invented the Guan Dao with his green dragon crescent blade, hence the name of the weapon. I won't get into an argument about whether or not this story is true. It's probably not, but it's a nice story, and that's that. General Guan Yi is often found in statue or picture form in most traditional kung fu schools because he exemplifies some of the positive aspirational characteristics of a martial artist. As I mentioned previously, in terms of the historical usage of the Guan Dao, it seems to have most often been used by infantry. However, some sites claim that it was more often used by cavalry. The weapon can be used for high torque cutting attacks, for hooking and parrying other weapons, for hooking and manipulating opponents, and for simple strikes or stabs using the back counterweight of the weapon. As such, it's a good all-round battlefield weapon for use by infantry. It's not as specialized for dealing with heavily armored opponents, but for an unarmored or lightly armored, for unarmored or lightly armored opponents, it's a very good tactical choice. Despite its ferocious appearance, some proponents of contemporary wushu practice claim that it's predominantly a defensive rather than an offensive weapon. Now, I can understand where that opinion would be coming from and what would motivate it, being that the weapon has a lot of manipulative and catching hooks and serrations on the back. However, based on the existing historic depictions and military manifests, it was clearly issued as a battlefield weapon, and most heavy infantry battlefield weapons were not issued to be primarily defensive in nature. In fact, you could potentially make the same argument about a modern combat rifle, for instance, issued to the military, that it's primarily defensive because it's used to hold ground, but it would be quite a stretch to call a modern combat rifle a purely defensive weapon. So there is an argument that can be made either way. The Guan Dao was said to have sometimes been used against cavalry, and the hooks on the back can be seen to be perhaps useful for hooking an opponent on horseback, dragging them off, while the big heavy blade could certainly be effective against the horse itself, as distasteful as this may sound to some modern sensibilities. Of course, when you were on an ancient battlefield and you were facing a cavalry charge, the niceties of modern sensitivity are not foremost in your mind. What's foremost in your mind is surviving. There are also some historic depictions and accounts of the Guan Dao being used from horseback. This is certainly possible, although I would hazard a guess that the Guan Daos intended for use on cavalry would have been modified somewhat to perhaps reduce weight and reduce reach to a certain extent. Use of melee weapons by soldiers in modern military actions is obviously very limited due to the prevalence and effectiveness of other weapons like firearms and explosives and tanks and planes, and the list goes on. Probably the most common exception is the combat knife. which still plays a very valuable role and is issued to my knowledge, all militaries around the world have some form of combat knife. But what I will say is that with few exceptions, the combat knife is mostly utilitarian and not used in combat. There are of course exceptions to that, but those are more the exception rather than the rule. Pole arms and other mass battlefield weapons usually do not feature at all. However, the Wikipedia article on the Guan Dao actually mentions its use recently at the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, between China and India. I found this quite interesting, and so I dug up a couple of articles and photos depicting Chinese soldiers wielding Guan Dao-like weapons. Now, in this particular case, due to an agreement in place, apparently, the use of firearms is not allowed in these kind of border skirmishes, because apparently, allegedly, lethal use of firearms would be considered an act of war. However, it appears that bloody melee-based skirmishes do not constitute acts of war. So in this particular confrontation, it appears that the Indian army fired warning shots into the air and thus dissuaded the PLA soldiers from continuing their advance. Thinking about this unique set of circumstances sets the Guan Dao in a new kind of light. If firearms cannot be used in a modern setting, but you are facing soldiers equipped with modern combat gear, the Guan Dao may be a tactically sound decision. Modern soldiers are armored, but typically only in certain parts of the body, such as the head with a ballistic helmet, for instance, and the torso with a ballistic plate carrier. There are typically no full plate wearing soldiers out there, to my knowledge. Typically, I'm sure you'll be able to dredge up some exception to that rule, but typically you won't find that. So in this instance, a large bladed cutting polearm weapon can be quite effective if the wielder targets unarmored parts of the body, such as the arms and the legs. So, as with most cutting polearms, the Guan Dao provides significant cutting and reach advantages over shorter one-handed bladed weapons, such as swords, for instance. The pole shaft allows for superior leverage and control to be applied via a wide two-handed grip, enabling the whole body to be more easily coordinated behind a swing or a cut. This dramatically increases the cutting torque behind the Guan Dao blade over that associated with a one-handed blade. No one human being's wrist is stronger than another human being's entire body. However, this dramatic increase in cutting torque can come at the cost of cutting impact velocity, because it takes more time and energy to move the wielder's whole body behind a strike than to swing a single-handed blade with one arm. So a certain trade-off might be expected there. The impact velocity of the Guan Dao can of course be increased significantly by sliding the hands further down the shaft away from the blade in a swing. But this comes at the cost of weapon control, which, at least in our system of Kung Fu, is paramount when using the Guan Dao. In our case, the right hand typically stays pretty close to the disc guard at the base of the blade itself, and does not shift much down the shaft, except in momentary cases for certain specific strikes, blocks and counters. This means that our cutting typically occurs at typical arm's length away from the body. However, the fighting techniques also involve a lot of skillful use of stances, arm movement and leaping attacks in order to extend this range as far as possible and counteract the close-in grip on the weapon. In addition, there are many attacks that are launched using the back end of the Guan Dao, which allows for more range because more of the Guan Dao shaft length is used. As I've mentioned in many earlier videos about my folding weapons platform, I've always intended to build a Guan Dao blade to attach to the folding pole. I won't go into detail on the folding pole here because there are many other videos in which I do that. I encourage you to refer to one of these older videos if you're interested. There's even a basic CAD design up on our website for free download, as I mentioned before, if you want to build that web. As I already mentioned, I trawled through a selection of antique examples of functional Guan Daos. I wasn't really interested in the more modern designs or those designed specifically for martial arts practice. I was more so looking for Guan Dao designs that might have been present on an ancient battlefield. After looking through the basic blade designs, I decided on one in particular. Although there were clearly antique examples and historic depictions of Guan Daos with more pointed thrusting tips, there were also many examples that emphasized an extreme curving cutting tip, very similar to the Japanese naginata. This was more like the blade design that our forms and techniques are built around, so I opted for an emphasized cutting tip. Of course, I based the scale of the blade on these historic examples as well. I had considered building this Guan Dao blade out of many different materials in the past, including titanium and composite plastics. However, I finally decided to go back to basics and build it using steel. Not just any steel though, 4mm thick Hardox 450, which is a pre-hardened steel used for industrial equipment and wear plates. The quality, hardness and uniformity represented in this steel would put most historic steel Guan Daos to shame. It should be said though that Hardox 450 is not as hard as typical knife steels, but you don't really want or need this kind of hardness in a polearm blade. In fact, harder steels may chip or break under the heavier impacts that can be achieved with polearm blades, depending of course on how thick the steel is. Whereas a slightly softer steel is more resistant to high impacts and less likely to fracture or fail catastrophically. In addition, if you want to use thicker and harder steel, you'd have to deal with added weight, but that will slow your movements and attacks down, so that's not ideal either. I cut out my blank using my old bandsaw, cleaned the edges a bit and left it in vinegar overnight to get rid of most of the rust coating. I then cleaned up the edges properly on my little belt sander. I did use my angle grinder for some grinding in this case, but I had to be quite careful not to overheat the steel to the point where it would lose its heat treatment. I was going to do a lot of the edge grinding actually using an angle grinder, as I've done on other projects using Hardox. But I ended up doing most of that on the belt sander this time. It took me about an hour to grind in the edge profiles on the belt sander, so a lot faster than I expected actually. I cut out a small disc guard from Hardox 450 as well and finished that off. Once I drilled and ground out a slot for the blade, I slotted the disc guard on and welded it in place. You'll notice I left a tang on the back end of the blade that would slot into the business end of my folding pole. I then did the final polish on the blade and blued it using Birchwood KC Super Blue. Once this was done, I started work on the decorative dragon scales, the dragon head scales. These are often seen on traditional Guan Daos, but in this case I also took some inspiration from the carved prows of Viking ships, and also partially from the shape of the Celtic carnix. I did this instead of using more traditional Eastern dragon design, just as an acknowledgement of some of my own heritage, which is more Nordic and Celtic. Anyway, I cut the decorative dragon scales out of 4mm thick aluminium, carved out their profiles using a variety of needle files and Dremel attachments. I then ran over the finished scales using a wire drill brush attachment to give the aluminium a battered, sort of weather-beaten look. Once this was done and the scales were attached, I added some 2mm thick aluminium spacers to the tang and attached the blade to the pole after drilling the attachment holes. This was pretty much all of the build that I documented photographically. I also wanted to make the folding pole, my existing folding pole, more comfortable to use though. So what I did not document was that I cut out 3mm thick G10 fiberglass scales for all of the titanium langet sections so that they could be slightly fatter and more rounded for a more comfortable and secure grip. This has made a considerable difference to the handling of the weapon, so I'm happy that I did it. The pole now feels much more comfortable to use. Now, despite the fact that this project contains many departures from the traditional Guan Dao design, such as the use of more modern materials like pultruded fiberglass spars and titanium, the overall blade shape, design and edge profile are actually quite traditional. A typical Guan Dao sports a small counterbalance at the rear end of the shaft, as I mentioned earlier, which is shaped a bit like a small mace head with a point on the end. This allows it to be used for percussive striking and for some thrusting with the point. I decided to depart from this traditional counterbalance design for the Dark Flame Dragon Guan Dao. Instead of a percussive tip, I wanted more cutting options available. So I opted to incorporate a miniature monk's spade attachment as the counterbalance. This I cut from the same 4mm thick Hardox steel, ground in the edge, polished the blade and blued the steel. However, I did not fully sharpen the blade and I kept it dull, at least for the mini monk's spade attachment. Just as a traditional monk's spade is, it's not traditionally sharpened into a cutting edge like a sword or a knife is. Now, although I'm also considering building a solid, continuous pultruded fiberglass pole as an optional alternative shaft for the Dark Flame Dragon blade, I have actually grown quite attached to the fact that with the folding pole, I can actually fold the weapon. So I can actually fold the weapon, and I've got the weapon here, and just have to make sure I'm not cutting my leg off while I do this. So folds up like so. As you can see, I've got a little sheath on the end of it. The blade's quite sharp. So folds up into a fairly compact size. Not quite, obviously not quite half the length of the pole because the blade sticks out quite a bit. So once folded, it can be stowed for transport or even placed in a purpose-made sheath, like the one that I constructed for one of my previous weapon builds, the folding composite naginata called Kanazuki, so that potentially the Dark Flame Dragon blade Guan Dao could be carried at the hip or even strapped onto a backpack. Perhaps those Chinese soldiers at the LAC between China and India may have appreciated a Guan Dao design that could allow their weapons to be folded away for easy transport. It's some pretty rugged high altitude terrain that they would have had to cross to get to the LAC carrying long bulky weapons. I did end up building a small cover for the blade out of polypropylene plastic sheet, as you saw earlier, because the blade's quite sharp and feels a bit dangerous when left exposed. It also allows the option of training with the weapon covered and the edges made safe, such as in the case of beginners using the weapon for the first time. Comment below actually if you would like to see me build a carry sheath for the Dark Flame Dragon blade folding Guan Dao, and whether you think it should be backpack mountable, belt worn, or capable of both modes of carry. One thing I should mention is that the weapon can be dismantled by removing the large central pivot bolt. This leaves you with two shorter weapon sections. First of all, the monk's spade section here, and the bladed section here. This half can very easily be used on its own in this kind of dismantled state as a type of long-handled Dadao, or large knife. It's hard to have that functionality, or I should say it's handy to have this kind of functionality for close quarters fighting, where a longer polearm might actually get in the way or be restricted in its movement. Because, you know, it's good to have an option for cleaning greasy stains in those hard to reach places. So with all of that out of the way, let's go on to the fun part, which is testing the Dark Flame Dragon Blade Guan Dao.
It's in the bone! It's in the bone!
So instead of just doing standard bottle cutting, I put the weapon through a standardized multi-target test. Now, I'm not aware of any other creator or weapons tester on YouTube who regularly does this. Most weapons testers use single static targets such as water bottles or tatami mats or the like to demonstrate weapon cutting performance. So I thought I'd explain my reasoning to give greater context as to why I often use a multi-target setup. While I don't have any problem with seeing people demonstrating weapon performance against a single static target, or even doing that myself for that matter, I do not believe that this gives much of an indication of the weapon's handling and speed while under pressure, such as while fighting in desperate melee against multiple targets. So my multi-target tests are intended to simulate this kind of desperate multi-target melee situation, where the weapon must be brought to bear against all target threats as quickly as possible. Now, of course, it's not opposed in this case, so it doesn't model all of the complexities of an actual combat, but it does place me under significant time pressure, which is a form of psychological pressure that can impact performance. So it gives a little bit of a better indication of how well the weapon handles under that kind of pressure. It's actually very similar to the kind of multi-target setups that are common on combat firearm courses, for instance. So I like to incorporate this kind of multi-target test as part of my weapons testing videos. I usually use multiple hanging plastic water bottles as the targets in the multi-target segment. But in past videos, I have actually used a very variable, haphazard arrangement. So in this video, I decided to standardize it. So I standardized it to a 2x3 grid of targets at 2 meter spacings. My starting position is now typically going to be in the middle of one of the 2x2 quadrants, as shown in the graphic. And this is what the multi-target test looked like. It's a bit of fun, of course, but it just gives a little bit of an idea of how well the weapon handles at speed and under a little bit of pressure. Now, a few videos back, we did develop a method of testing weapon cutting performance called the impulse cut method, which was based in part on our impulse block method. However, based on reading between the lines of feedback and the metrics on the video in which I introduced the impulse cut method, I will only rarely use this very detailed and comprehensive method to measure weapon cutting performance. I think it's just a bit too analytical for the YouTube backyard cutting test space into which it's being applied. Backyard cutting tests are meant to be just a bit of a fun spectacle, like explosions on the Mythbusters series, and not just an avalanche of science. And so we'll save ourselves the hours of number crunching that the impulse cut method takes. Now, in conclusion, I absolutely love the Dark Flame Dragon Blade Guan Dao. I'm happy to have built it finally, and I'm really happy to own it. Typically there's a little bit of post, at least in my case, when I build a weapon, there's a bit of post-weapon trauma or anxiety in which I kind of totally go off what I've built, and only later on do I warm up again to the weapon and start really liking it and picking up its nuances and just starting to appreciate it again. In this case, there was no post-weapon trauma or sort of anxiety or separation. I just loved it. I've incorporated it into all of my regular training, and it just feels wonderful. It's light, it's nimble, it's robust, it cuts very well. I hope you liked seeing it too, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.